Hello out there, all you delightful deer. Thanks for joining us for another episode of A Little Greener, podcast all about nature, conservation, and sustainability. Oh, we're off to a great start. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Sarah, and I am joined by the delightful Casey. How are you doing, Casey?
Hi, I'd like to pass on that question because it's been a week, but thank you guys for bearing with us as we delayed. Just life is in the way and it happens, but we're here. That was honestly impressive, Sarah. The delivery I was impressed with up until sustainability because we've been out of practice for a little bit.
We
So,
are. Yeah, our schedule is going to be a little bit irregular here for a little bit. I've got some things coming up as well, but we are, never fear, not going anywhere. We'll keep up with episodes. It may just not quite be every other week for a little bit here, and then we'll get back on track again. So
w
thanks
w
for
thanks for bearing with us. We don't get paid for this. This is our I was gonna say this is our side hustle, but we don't get
it's
paid,
not
so this is
yeah.
just our hobby.
But we enjoy doing it, and it's always lovely to see you, Casey. And this is, even when it has been a week, this is a nice little bright spot. So
Yeah, it's a little dip into nature. It reminds me, kind of grounds me again in things that I like. Today I saw a swallowtail butterfly on a Joe Pye weed. That was super cool.
lovely.
Yeah, there's nature around us. There's abundance. Thanks for tuning in again. Sarah, let's just jump into today's topic
Yeah,
if we
let's do it. I was trying to rack my brain to think if I had any updates or past challenges or anything like that, and I sadly can't think of a whole lot. It really does feel like it's been another one of those periods where I just haven't even really been getting my outside time in except for the running,
I
and
was gonna say not true. I see your pictures outside
sure,
running.
but it's, mostly just running around my neighborhood. There's not really a lot of green spaces or wildlife appreciation there. But and also we're almost done with July at this point. It's plastic free July. I like to try to
Oh yeah.
do a thing or make a swap or pick a change, and I didn't even get on board with that this year. So I'm definitely feeling a little out of the groove. So all that to say, yeah, let's go ahead and just jump in to our topic for today.
Great. We're going straight into, I guess this is nature and conservation in an
Yeah.
interesting way. So, Sarah, we're going to be talking about white-tailed deer today. They're the state animal of my home state of
Ooh,
Pennsylvania. Yeah, I know you love a good state
I
animal.
do.
And when I read that, I was like, of course they are. They're
I wonder how
everywhere.
many states, like if multiple states, because you know how a million states
Or the
have the
cardinal
cardinal.
for the
Yeah,
bird.
exactly.
Yeah. I don't know, but like, and that's, I guess, part of my question is that white-tailed deer are actually the large mammal in the Americas with the widest range. They go from southern Canada through United States, through Mexico, Peru. These are hugely widespread animals. They're largely absent from the American West. But I was wondering, like, do you see white-tailed deer in Florida?
We do. And just to, sorry, my audio took a little jump there. You said they go all the way through Central America and down as far south as where?
Peru.
Peru. Amazing.
Isn't that cool?
And yes, we do have them throughout the state of Florida as well. I don't see them a ton. As I was just saying, my neighborhood is not like in any way connected to green space. We just even, yards are small and fenced and all of that, busy streets around the neighborhood. So not a super convenient place for deer to be able to get to. But we do definitely see them. The other neighborhood that I'll do my long runs in, they've seen deer a couple of times now. And one of my friends that lives that way, she says that they see them pretty regularly in the mornings, and I love that. Like, it makes me, I was so excited the first time I came across a deer when I was running there. So that's fun. And a state park not too far away, you see deer pretty regularly. So definitely not an uncommon occurrence. And I know that they are found throughout the state, including down in the Keys, where we have the key deer, which I learned is actually a subspecies of whitetail deer that I
So
didn't actually
cool.
know that. So
So cool. I did just do a quick Google. They're the state animal of 9 states. So hi, everybody out there in a bunch of other states.
That's what happens when you have a wide range.
That's right. And because they have a wide range, we're not going to be talking about every aspect of white-tailed deer today. We're actually going to kind of centralize a little bit on Pennsylvania to talk about it in a little bit more of a micro context. But today we're going to be talking about my state's state animal, white-tailed deer, a little bit about their ecology and some conservation impacts. So stick around. All right, back to our main topic of the day. We're talking about white-tailed deer today. So I want to just start a little bit just about the basics of white-tailed deer, kind of where they lie in the animal kingdom. Sarah, do you have any background of what are their closest relatives? Where can you kind of find them on the great tree of life?
I mean, they're deer.
They are
So there are
in the
other
name.
deer species. I think in this part of the world, probably when somebody says deer, white-tailed deer is
The
it.
default
Yeah,
image.
but there's
Yeah.
lots of different species of deer. I personally have a soft spot for the muntjac, little tiny species of
Oh, they are
deer.
cute. Yeah.
But mule deer, there's lots of different species. They are ruminant animals, so you think like a cow, they have that chambered stomach that helps them eat some of those tougher leafy leaves and stems. They are hooved animals, so they're what we would call even-toed ungulates. So that just means that they have hooves and they have the deer have two toes, as it were.
Yeah, they're related to some other iconic species like moose and elk
Hmm.
and caribou slash reindeer. If you're not from the US, Bambi.
That's yeah.
That's yeah,
I was gonna say we'll probably make multiple Bambi references, but yes, that is
that's who we're
the
talking about.
quintessential white-tailed deer. Also, just a random aside, but I'm getting ready to travel out to Colorado next
Yeah,
week, and white-tailed deer, beautiful, graceful. I don't know how much they weigh, but they're sort of a like
they're a
medium-sized deer, really.
medium-sized
They're
deer.
not
Yeah,
very big. I think they're beautiful, graceful, love them. Moose, I'm terrified. I'm
I I love
actually
moose.
terrified. There's they just feel like a entirely different thing to me.
I saw my first moose at the Columbus Zoo. I think they're just the the coolest. They're so
Ugh.
interesting. I've
They're
seen a lot of
not
elk out in
okay, yeah.
Colorado, and those are like white-tailed deer on steroids. Like they're
Yeah.
all the most majestic parts
I'll take
of a
an
white-tailed
elk.
deer.
Moose just scare me.
I mean, fair enough. Moose, a whole different ballgame. We can talk about them and their particular
We'll
conservation issues too,
we'll
because
give
they're
them a different
so
episode.
interesting. But yeah, this is about white-tailed deer, not their ginormous
Sorry,
cousins.
just sidetracking.
Um, as you can expect from an animal that's so wide-ranging, these are generalists. Like this should be a quintessential generalist, which means that they're going to exploit a wide variety of both habitats and food resources. So they tend to avoid really dense forests, but they live all around lots of forest edges, lots of forests with young growth coming up. And in my area, in a lot of urban places too. You need a surprisingly small space to find deer. I thought my neighborhood had none at all, and they really don't cross the street, but I live across the street from a like big open area, and I
Mhm.
looked across the fence the other day. There were like four white-tailed
Oh,
deer, and they were playing. I
oh.
thought at first that they were running from a predator because they were like bucking and like
Uh-huh.
playing, but they were chasing each other around a tree. It was really cute.
I love that.
Precious. Social groupings tend to be matrilineal. So typically you're going to see females together with their offspring. They generally chase away their yearling offspring from the previous year before they give birth, but their yearling offspring will then rejoin them. Oftentimes, males will disperse from that main group, but you can see several generations of deer sometimes when you see
Yeah.
big herds. For males, though, outside of the breeding season, typically once the breeding season ends, they'll find a friend, two or three, and they will hang out together in their own kind of bachelor herds too. So you'll see that as well. And the more I thought about deer and read about them, the more I think about how their life is so, because they are generalists, they are so dictated by the seasons.
Sure. And
What's
I mean, I was gonna
available,
say,
like
yeah, availability of food is just a huge thing.
it's such a huge part of them. I know that this has to be true of like every animal
Sure,
out there,
I
but
know.
but it felt so salient to like every conversation I could have about deer because it dictates their social groupings, it dictates their habitat use, their diets, their priorities during that time of year. So I kind of want to break down, at least in Pennsylvania, because these time periods shift depending on different times of year. Apparently, southern deer in the US typically are smaller than the ones up where I'm at. So they range really widely in how big they get. But here in Pennsylvania, fawning season, when they start to give birth, starts around May. So the female will chase away any offspring that was from the year before, hanging out with her, and she's going to focus on her baby or babies. Females, on average, give birth to about two at a time. Um,
Really, two is the average?
yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about it in depth about a study, but they did a study on trying to figure out, because I was trying to figure out the reproductive rates of
Hmm.
white-tailed deer, and based on looking at basically deer bodies, they were able to see the amount of fetuses that they had in them. And typically in the first year that the female gives birth, it's a singleton, but after that, it typically is twins and sometimes can be three or even four. So
Wow.
poor mama deer, yeah.
Yeah, for real.
And those fawns come out very, very small, and look exactly like Bambi, basically.
Hmm.
As summer progresses, they're really about packing on the pounds. They're about the mother is going to be nursing that fawn, trying to raise them up to be a little bit more self-sufficient, but they're hanging out together. The males are trying to get as much resources into their bodies as possible, and they start to grow antlers, which is the fastest growing mammalian tissue.
I read about that. That's so crazy.
It is so cool. It like basically they have little nubs on their skulls and they start to grow cartilage up. And there's blood vessels and it's covered in velvet, and then they eventually will harden into bone, but they can grow up to an inch a day,
Yeah.
which is
Can
crazy.
you imagine? Like, what if our fingernails grew like that fast? You know?
It'd be
Like,
insane. Like moose apparently during their peak will put on a pound of bone a day. That's so
oh,
crazy.
yeah.
So they are investigating that as like what sort of things medically can we learn from this? Because also you would think that rapidly dividing cells would mean lots of cancer, but there's not a lot of deer bone cancer when it comes to that. So there's lots to learn from that really unique part of being a deer. It's the males that put on the horns, although or antlers. Horns are different.
Yes.
Antlers. But females occasionally will grow antlers. That just sometimes, very rarely, will happen.
Interesting. Yeah, I
But
didn't know that either.
yeah, it happens. As the summer comes to an end, the antlers are hardening around July to August. And that's when the breeding season starts to go into effect towards the fall. It seems to be dictated by a female going into estrus, not by necessarily like all of the males all are synced
Hmm.
up together. They
Yeah.
are synced up more in timing with the
Response.
estrus of the
Yeah.
females. Yep. And the female's estrus period a little bit varies depending on when they were born and like the time of year that they were born and how old they are. Because the fawns can reproduce as early as like 7 to 8 months, or at least can get pregnant in that time period.
Hmm.
So their first year on Earth, they can
They're having a
potentially
baby.
have a baby. Yep, it's crazy. This is also called rut. So the males do a lot of different behaviors. They will scratch on the ground. They have a lot of scent glands in their hooves that they're trying to spread that around. This is where you will, if you're a homeowner with a tree and you have an issue with deer rubbing up against it, this is typically when that's happening. And It's called rut. I also call it stupid season because it's when the males really have like one priority, and that's when it's super dangerous to drive around them here because they are very dumb.
You just never
Because
know when they're
just
popping out.
they're not making good decisions.
Yeah.
They're only thinking about one thing. They can lose up to 25% of their body weight during this time period from the beginning of rut to the end of it because they are so singularly focused on breeding. Females will enter a period of estrus. It's a fairly short window, but if she does not successfully mate with a male, she will go into it in the next month. She can do that. They did a study of them in a captive situation. They found that she would do that 7 times before kind of the body would be like, I guess we're
Hmm.
not breeding this year.
So your odds are pretty good then
Mhm.
of ending up pregnant.
Sure are. One study showed that white-tailed deer in the Midwest had pregnancy rates of about 69%, but that included those first-year fawns who are not as likely to be pregnant.
Hmm.
So, amongst yearlings and females, that rate is much, much higher. It's more like in the 80s. So, a lot of females are getting pregnant, and if the older females are getting pregnant, they're most likely getting pregnant with two fawns. Other studies have shown pregnancy rates being much higher. Like we're talking about up to 100% in some of these samplings. So white-tailed deer are kind of like rabbits. You can think about them like giant bunnies around here. Most white-tailed deer do mate in that second year, but again, the females will reproduce very, very young. Captive white-tailed deers live an average of about 16 years is the data that I found. But in the wild, I could not find good data about the average age of a white-tailed deer. It seems like most deer don't make it to 10, but even other resources were saying they rarely make it to 5.
Wow.
So again, I couldn't find like a good longevity study about these because typically these deer are like not obviously living to their peak lifespan for a variety of reasons. Deer populations historically, talking at each ecological level, were controlled mostly top down. So that means that typically it's pressure from predators that are keeping the populations at their carrying capacity at their level versus the amount of food available
Hmm.
because they do exploit so many food resources. A study in Pennsylvania, they looked at deer have been hit by cars and they identified over 100 different types of plants in the stomachs of deers, and lots of them weren't
Yeah.
identifiable. So typically it was going to be large predators and it was by Native American hunting practices as well, historically, prior to European colonization. These are, like I said, rabbits around here, basically. So when you get in this situation, I always think it's interesting because we often conceptualize prior to European colonization as being like pre-human impact on the environment. But obviously, Native Americans
Right.
were part of that mechanism for control. And as one of the things we'll talk about, they didn't necessarily have a system that either formally or informally prioritized killing male deer. They were more opportunistic. So that was in conjunction with wolves and bears and mountain lions,
Right.
effective control. Sarah, do you have any like I know you said you don't see them you see them sometimes in Florida, but have you been like up close and personal with white-tailed deer before?
Oh, I mean, I'm sure in a like under human care scenario at
Okay.
times I have, when I was a kid. And I mean, like last month, I think probably sometime I encountered one running that was just munching on some bushes right near the sidewalk and let me kind of skirt right around her where she was just chilling. So I did get a pretty up close look at a wild deer not too long ago. Yeah.
My dad's yard, there's frequently 12 to 13 deer.
Yeah.
I remember we were watching them from the car because and this was a couple years ago, they were just walking within 10 feet of my car.
Hmm.
And after a while, I'd been sitting in my car for like 10, 15 minutes waiting for them to go somewhere else. And they were like, no, we're just chilling. So I let Ginger out, my dog, and she immediately went and started chasing down these deer. And I was like, you are 20 pounds. Please don't do this. But she was like nipping at their heels. Very dangerous. Don't let your dog do
Yeah.
that. I was not happy. But when I was a kid, my most visceral memory of white-tailed deer is driving at night through Valley Forge
Yeah.
Historical National Park. And when you would drive down the road, we would drive, remember, we would get off like the highway coming out of Philly or something like that into Valley Forge. You're immediately in the park, and immediately we slow down to a crawl. And as you look out the window, there are dozens of pairs of eyes looking at you because in the headlight reflection, you can see all of these deer. And it's amazing because as you're driving, some of them will lift their head up out of the grasses and you just see more eyes appear. Valley Forge Historical National Park at that time period had about 241 deer per square mile.
So many deer.
It's so many. So when I think of seeing like 100 deer while driving through that, like maybe even more through Valley Forge, that's not an exaggeration. This is not like my memory playing a trick on me of like
Right.
there were so many deer. There were so many deer.
And that, I mean, that's super cool. Not to interrupt your story, but I
Yeah.
just want to say, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later too, but like and I grew up in Indiana, lots of deer there too. I'm very thankful that I never had a close encounter in the car. Like, we see the deer
Right.
crossing signs everywhere and just, I mean, because that is scary.
Hmm.
Like, that
Oh
would
yeah.
be super cool to see all of those eyes, but also that is just sort of a visceral reminder for me, like how scary that can be to when you do have them around. And deer versus car situation is not
Yes.
ideal either way.
We'll go more in depth with that too a little bit later on, but deer can run 40 miles per hour at short clips, so they really can come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
I a couple months ago I had to swerve to get out. I've seen so many deer on the roads. But let's go back further in
Yes.
history, starting more towards when we had this period prior to colonization where we sort of had I think ecosystem balance is not necessarily a great term because the world is always in flux. There's always events happening that throws that balance one way or another. But there were an environment that existed for thousands of years that had certain control measures on it that controlled the deer population. So when European colonists arrive, most of Pennsylvania was forest. Pennsylvania means Penn's woods. And they immediately started clearing those forests for their farms to create agriculture for timber, to just have areas to live. And prior to colonization, the rates of deer were about 8 to 10 deer per square mile is the estimation. So again, think about that Valley Forge number from earlier, 241, way above normal elements. But over the next 100 years, as both Native Americans were pushed out of their homes and large predators were started to be evicted from the ecosystem, whether through habitat loss or direct kills, white-tailed deer were hunted by European settlers. And they were actually hunted really aggressively by them. In Europe, wildlife was seen as the property of the person who owned the land that they were on. And in the United States at that time, it's wildlife was sort of for everybody. So people would go out and kill deer to feed their families, and they would often send the hides back to Europe. So there was an industry, and then there was also just feeding your family meat. But at some point, that really tipped the scales to almost eradicate deer from Pennsylvania in the late 1800s, which is so strange to think about for me. I,
Given the 241 per square mile
Right.
that
I
you're
mean,
used
like I
to.
was thinking, what is more common in Pennsylvania? Groundhogs or deer? I don't know. But yeah, they were almost entirely gone, which was a problem for conservationists who realized that this was not the normal thing going on in Pennsylvania. But then, of course, the dwindling population meant that it was harder and harder to find deer to hunt. So that's when the Game Commission of Pennsylvania came in and they started trying to reintroduce deer. It was a really big issue with the local population who, for the last 100 plus years, had been just hunting deer willy-nilly, however they thought, and now someone was coming in to put rules on their tradition, and that was not seen positively there. But successfully, even through conflict, like many game officers were actually killed during this period over this sort of regulation, the deer population started coming back along with the forests that were starting to recover. But really, it was prime habitat for the deer because you have these forests starting to send up shoots of all these young trees, which is one of deer's favorite food.
Yeah.
So it was just like, okay, we have a really rapidly reproducing population of animals that all of a sudden come into just a jackpot of food that is out there for them. And now their top-down control has been better regulated than it was. And that was a recipe for just populations going through the roof over the next 100 years. It's so hard to think about deer as like an endangered
Yes.
species in Pennsylvania.
I mean, that's what I was thinking. It's just like we just have such a sort of a limited perspective, I think, most of us. It's just so hard to imagine this needing to be a species of concern, but also just thinking about I'm not going to be able to put this into words appropriately, but just thinking about all of the ways that all of these things are interconnected and how we play a role in the control and how, like the difference between the and I like appreciate what you said about balance and things always being in flux, but like where population levels were at pre-colonization
Right.
versus like I don't know, because we are factors, right? We're humans, we're living things, we need to,
Yeah, but it's
do all,
weird to
but
think about us eating an animal
yeah,
to out of an area.
yeah. And of course, like you were saying, it not just hunting them and eating them, but also taking away their space and taking away other natural predators too. Like there's just, I don't know.
There's a
It's
whole
very
system.
interesting.
I think also about this in almost terms of like, what's the difference really in colonization and migration? And there's so many factors that play into that. But
Sure.
ecologically, we see over a natural time period, it's similar to climate change, where like you will have these natural fluctuations, but typically nature responds in a way that fills the void or is able to adjust to the new climate, whether it's climate temperature wise or whatever the community of the ecosystem is. But then when you have something like colonization of the eastern United States, all of a sudden, like all the factors are blown out of the water at a pace that nature cannot accommodate.
Right.
And that's where you see like this jarring effect of wildlife being pushed out. Over time, there's a couple things that happened. I'm not going to go all the way into all the populations tracked over time, but they did institute a buck hunting season. I think this is really interesting because that's always how I thought of hunting is strictly as hunting bucks.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that's the antler situation. Like
Right.
hunters will talk to each other about the amount of
The
points on the
points. Yeah.
antler. Yes, exactly. And I do think there's a certain element of like American chivalry part of it is like it's almost more polite to shoot the males than it is to shoot the females. That's like a part of the culture of it. I'm not just making that up. That is like part of some of the game commission's thoughts on the history of it. But what they found is that buck hunting wasn't really working as a control measure. Like as these populations were starting to ramp back up, looking at now an overabundance of deer as we get later in the 1900s into the early 2000s, hunting bucks doesn't properly control the situation. And they did a lot of studies and showed that hunting both ducks and bows, bucks and does, um, are is much more effective for controlling
Interesting.
populations. That being said, like I'm not a hunter myself.
Nope.
Not for me.
Couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it.
Couldn't do it. And I have some like more particular thoughts about things like trophy hunting in like a conservation context.
which we've talked a little bit on the podcast
We
before.
have, yeah. It's got its uses, it's also got its problems.
Mhm.
As a kid, I would have been my uncle hunts things, and I was horrified because I had a lot of deep empathy for animals. Now, as someone looking at it from a broader context, hunting is so necessary
Yeah.
because that is how they were controlled traditionally, both by humans
Hmm.
and by natural predators. And so, unless you want to reintroduce wolves into an area, which has been controversial out west and certainly wouldn't really work
Not
out
be
here.
feasible. Yeah.
Right. There's no habitat. There just isn't enough stretch of habitat for them, let alone coming into conflict with humans and posing a danger. Hunting, like the other option, the only other things, this is what Doug Tallamy says in his book Bringing Home Nature, is the only things keeping the deer in check are cars and starvation.
Ugh,
Right? Isn't that awful? Like when you think about like, oh, but do we want to kill an animal? It's like, well, they're gonna
they're gonna
die.
die. Yeah.
Is it so much worse to have us be an active participant in that? Or we're still gonna do it accidentally
Yep.
with cars, and like there's going to be slow death because we are far above the carrying capacity. And Sarah, do you want to share with us what carrying capacity is?
Just the ability, in this case, what we're talking about is of the habitat to support the population of animals that is living on it.
Yeah, basically you can like estimate this total number of a population should be at before it starts self-controlling from things like starvation. So we're way above carrying capacity for where we're at for a healthy ecosystem. And deer aren't necessarily benefiting from that. Obviously, as a population, if life is just job is to perpetuate life, then yes, they are succeeding mightily. But like on an individual level, this isn't necessarily healthy for this amount of deer. Part of the problem though is even when you are hunting deer, they are really hard to control their populations. A study in Michigan put 10 deer in an enclosed area. It's like fenced in, 1,100 acres, no predators. Go see how what that population is going to get to. Within 5 years, 10 deer became 200 deer.
Jeez. Ha.
Rabbits. They are, you could substitute in rabbits. It's so wild. And that's why even remnant populations in certain areas, you can hunt pretty aggressively, and it's very difficult to exterminate the deer, but it is also just difficult to control them to a
Hmm.
degree that is necessary. And so you might think, what is the danger to too many deer? Like deer, they're not hunting other animals. It's not like they're killing your cat. It's not like if you had an overpopulation of bears in an area, you can obviously see where that would be a problem. But it's not just a problem for the deer starving to death. It also has to do with the ecosystem as a whole. So, Sarah, what can you think of? You mentioned some before. What's the danger of being in proximity to deer or having too many deer?
Yeah, so like kind of aside from what we just talked about with the carrying capacity, there is danger potentially with human wildlife interaction. They're hit by cars can not only hurt the deer, but also people, hurt the car, hurt the people inside. Family members have had some scary incidents with deer car interactions in the past. And then, sort of ecologically, again, you got to think about that food web, right? So
Hmm.
if there's too many deer, then eventually they are going to overrun those things that they're eating. And the flip side of some of those deer starving to death are the deer that are there are going to be sort of decimating the populations of the food plants that they're consuming too.
Yeah, let's start with those two things. Car accidents. Pennsylvania is the place you're most likely to collide your car with the deer. The estimates vary. I found some estimates that were from the Insurance Institute and others from like State Farm. There's a National Highway Institute. There's a lot of different places that are like looking at this sort of data. Estimates vary, but between 1.5 and 1.9 million car collisions with deer occur each year. And that results in somewhere between 150 and 440 deaths a year. So people die in car accidents with deer. It's really challenging because they are coming at you often in the dark. They're most active around the
Dusk.
crepuscular time.
Yeah.
Yeah, dusk coming out there. And it certainly is extremely dangerous. It also is very expensive. People average about almost $4,000 in damages when they submit a claim. Obviously, this being largely through insurance industries, like this is possibly a larger amount than is even reported because, as Sarah and I talked about prior to this episode, insurance is a pain in the butt
Yep.
in all scenarios, and you don't always want to engage in it. Of the reported accidents with deer, Pennsylvania has about 10% of them. So we are largely overrepresented as far as the size of our state. We just have a lot of deer. Products like deer whistles, which I don't know if have you heard of a deer whistle
I've
before?
never heard of a deer whistle before.
So
I
I
didn't know
get
this was a thing.
I think they used to be more popular, but basically you could attach them to your car, and as you drive, how fast you went, put air through the deer whistle, and it made a high-pitched noise that supposedly the deer could hear, and they would know that the car was coming, and therefore stay away from the car coming.
Interesting.
However,
That's, I was gonna say, it's just, I know that you're about to say that there's not really evidence to support that this works, but I think that's a really interesting idea.
right, yeah, it
What an
is.
interesting thought.
Yeah,
Too bad. Too bad.
isn't it too bad? Yeah, studies have shown that we don't even know if they can hear it. Like,
Oh,
they
oh,
haven't shown,
well, that
let
seems
alone
like
effectiveness
that
of
would have
like,
been an important thing to investigate prior to.
they hear it, and then you're expecting them to know what to do when they hear it.
Right.
Both of those things seem like a lot, but apparently have really no evidence. Um, Car accidents go up about 16% the week after daylight savings.
Hmm.
That coincides with the rut period as well. So you're already at like high deer activity, but then you change the time of day that people are traveling. So it's darker when they're traveling, and there are more deer accidents. Within the study about deer reproduction, they cited some notes that are unpublished that basically coincided the estimated conception dates of these baby deer in conjunction with the number of car crashes around that time. So like in the weeks that where you have more car
Oh,
crashes, you are also having more
more.
deer conceived because that is
Gotcha.
the time period where stupid season, they're
Yeah.
not thinking, they're just trying to mate. So that's correlated with each other. It's very
Interesting.
much around that time of year. Although I have almost hit females, I have almost hit females in the spring. Like there's not necessarily you're not exclusively going to deal with this in the fall. And then you talked about forest regeneration, that food web, because the deer are often like, think about the deer in the winter. We talked about fawning season. We've got summer where you're packing on the pounds. You've got rut/stupid season. And winter to me is like starving season for deer. They're just
Sure.
trying to get
Absolutely.
through it.
Yep. Eaten bark.
Eating bark, trying to like this is when you will have deer. So work at a garden center, people are like, I got deer. What do I do? And so I did research about how you repel deer. And it again varies so much by season because in the spring it is much easier to get the deer to leave your stuff alone. But by late winter, the deer are desperate. It doesn't really like you've got to give them a huge deterrent to not try and get to whatever is able to be eaten. So by spring, when a lot of the plants are starting to regenerate and you've got young trees, the holes in forests once the old trees have fallen down, and now there's an opportunity for these young trees to come up and start filling that space, the deer just mow them down. This results in reduced presence of native tree species, but it also results in the reduction of other wildlife populations in the areas because small wildlife that also rely on these trees or the food resources that otherwise the deer are eating, they don't have that ability to live in that area. So it's not even just like they eat a lot of plants. It's they eat a lot of plants that somebody else could be
Right.
eating. It's also annoying to homeowners. Like I just interact with that almost every day.
I guess. I just wish I could see deer around my house.
I I don't care. I guess I do care. I do care if they ate my veggies, I would be really annoyed.
Sure.
I
Right. It's easy
so
for me to say when
it's
I don't
yeah,
have to deal with
when you don't have to deal with the
it.
negative consequences. If you can look at it from your deck or something,
Yeah.
that sounds lovely. And that's mostly what we would do at like my dad's house is we mostly see them from afar
Yeah.
and there's nothing ornamental that we're worried about them ruining.
My dad has a trail cam in the woods behind his house and sees a lot of deer in that, which is pretty cool. But again, they're a little further out, so
Yeah. I mean, an issue in my area is that there's a lot of development within our store, which is a garden center, which has a bunch of plants there that we
sure.
sell. There has been about 2,000 homes going up within 2 miles of the store. A giant school cleared out a huge field where the deer lived, and they have all been shoved up into this
Yeah.
wooded area right next to our store. And so this year was by far the worst that we've ever had of them coming up and like walking straight up to the store.
Hmm.
They walked houses overnight and ate some of my eggplants. They are so bold because they are hungry. They're also very smart. People don't give them credit for being smart. They understand risk reward. If they're not getting actively deterred from an area, if there's a bunch of yummy stuff there, they're going. But also, again, we're reducing these habitats to these small portions, and of course they're going to interact with us. We took away the spot that they were supposed to be eating natural things, and now they're going to eat your stuff, even if it's, in a lot of cases, even if it's not from here. Deer don't really care that much. They are exploiting whatever tastes good and whatever is available to them at that time period. Other issues, and we'll talk a little bit more about forest regeneration when we talk about what Valley Forge ended up doing. But another big issue is disease spread,
Hmm.
which chronic wasting disease is a disease that deer deal with within their own species and
Hmm.
across deer species. It is a prion disease, which I think has to do with like a mutation of a protein, and
Hmm.
it
Like mad
basically
cow disease is another prion disease. Yeah.
yes, that's a great example. So, it ends up, it's always fatal. It always kills the deer. The states on the game commission level are always on the lookout for chronic wasting disease, trying to monitor it, limit its spread, etc. The more deer you have, the more likely they're going to come in contact with another deer and then move it to another area. Brain worms.
Lovely.
Sarah, were you there when we worked together at our old job? There was a moose scientist that came.
No.
Oh my gosh, Dr. Seth was from Minnesota and he studied moose. And he was looking, and this is where we could do a whole moose episode, but he was looking at why were the moose populations in Minnesota dropping, and people were blaming the hunters for it. And he was able to determine that one of many factors had to do with the introduction of brain worms into the area, which is, as it sounds, a parasite that infects the brains of deer. And typically, how it spreads is the deer poops it out, and then a snail goes in the poop, and then the snail goes up into the tree, and then the deer eat the snail. They
Hmm.
get brainworms. And it's not always fatal, my understanding is, for deer, but it's like a parasite for them. But as climate change has progressed, the white-tailed deer are overlapping more with moose habitat, and the moose are eating the brainworms, and the brainworms are not a deer generalist. They are a white-tailed deer specific species. So when they hit the moose brain, they go, where did deer brain at? And basically chew holes in the brains of the moose and cause them to slowly die.
Parasitology is crazy, man.
Oh my gosh, it skews me out. I mean, like, I don't know how you can't be skeeved out by things that require living on or in other things, but gross. But yeah, so that is for a species like moose who is very climate impacted already, having a competitor move into the area, but also a disease vector move into the area is impacting other species. The other way that they're impacting other species is, hi, us,
Yeah.
Lyme's disease. Sarah, do you know anyone with Lyme disease?
Not uh no, no, I'm gonna say that and then somebody's gonna listen and be like, what are you talking about?
I had Lyme disease.
I but on the spot right now, I can't think of anyone.
So almost everyone in my family has had it except me.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a big issue here because we have so many deer. Pennsylvania has 1.5 million deer, spoil alert, a lot of deer. Um, there are certain ticks that mainly hang out on deer and are vectors for Lyme disease. And so the more the deer are around, the more the ticks are around. So yeah, my sister has had it, I think twice. But if it's left untreated, it can have
Right.
really awful symptoms like joint pain, swelling. When you're under treatment for it, you can't go out in the sun. Like there's all sorts of stuff that is really challenging, and there's also people who have it kind of long term. They have
Yeah.
long-term impacts of having Lyme's disease. There's also other things that they can transmit, other things ticks can kind of ride around. There's other diseases, but Lyme's disease is something that they were able to show in studies. If you reduce the deer population, you reduce the amount of prevalence of Lyme disease reported. So on Monhegan Island in Maine, prior to the study, 20% of people had contracted tick-borne diseases. And that's when the deer populations were at about 39 to 65 deer per square kilometer, which I know is a different measurement than we were using earlier, but I didn't do the conversion. It's a lot of deer. When the populations were then reduced down to 1 to 3 deer per square kilometer, which I assume you can do because it's an island, no new cases of tick-borne diseases were reported over the next 8 years.
Wow.
So this is corroborated by another study in 2014 that found that Lyme's disease reports were down 80% after reducing the deer population significantly. So Lyme disease is one of those that's kind of hard because most people, but not all people, get the little bullseye
Right.
rash that happens after you get bitten by the tick. So we don't always know like who all was infected. It's not always caught right away. Having at least 2 studies that show that, plus it sort of being intuitive that
Right.
one impacts the other, that's something. And I remember right at I don't know exactly the date, but it was when the pandemic felt like it was something that was ramping down and that we might be able to control or even in my naive brain maybe get rid of, is when they started reporting that COVID-19 had gone into white-tailed deer populations. And with all the deer around here, I was like, nope, it's here. It has a reservoir. Um, so lots of diseases can be attributed to these animals.
And I think that that is rarely a thing that's thought about as, well, I shouldn't say that, but I'm just like generally, general public. I don't know that when we talk about animal populations and overpopulations of certain species, that spread of disease is necessarily a concern that pops into people's minds. But yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before. The more animals that you have close together, that spread of disease can just kind of go crazy. And obviously, Lyme's disease is one that impacts us as people. Chronic wasting disease is not currently a zoonotic disease, which
Yeah.
doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about it in terms of spreading to other animals. But also, you never know what could happen in the future. So there are still like hunting guidelines and things like that for hunters if they
Yeah.
come across an animal with chronic wasting disease and all of that. So it's just a good thing to keep in mind that all of this is tied into the populations of different species.
Yeah. I think deer ticks that carry this feel like sort of an inevitability here. I know they're not as prevalent in other states, but like here it's just like, "Ugh, I went out in the woods and I'm gonna find ticks on me.
Hmm.
It's terrible." But knowing that there are certain things, like they've also done studies on rattlesnakes showing that more rattlesnakes could control tick populations by reducing mouse populations. Like all of these are connected to each other. So that being said, we just talked about how it's really hard to control deer populations. What are our options? Um, we could introduce wolves back.
Could we?
Could we? No, we can't. We really
I mean, it
can't.
depends on where you are, right?
Yes,
And so some places have
they
done.
have.
I
Yeah.
don't know a whole ton about it, honestly,
Oh, we'll have to do an
but
episode.
I
Yeah.
know that some places out west have done that. But as we were
Yeah.
saying, for you in Pennsylvania right now, not really a feasible option.
Well, it's extremely controversial amongst certain populations of people out west where they have done that. There's people who, especially ranchers, who have been very concerned about the impact on them. And there's so much more land that they wouldn't have to come in
Hmm.
contact with them. Another option that's floated but is really kind of theoretical is contraception. So how do we make sure the deer can't reproduce? We won't kill the deer, but we'll neuter the deer. We'll apply a contraceptive. There's not currently a contraceptive that is cost effective and 100% effective for
Hmm.
deer. So it's not really an option right now. It seems like something that people are pursuing. So if you're someone who's looking for like the most humane option that doesn't involve as much deer death, you're looking at not having as many deer in the first place. But that being said, what is most effective is hunting and controlled culls. So in Valley Forge National Park, I remember when I was a kid, they used to like mow the whole thing basically, because it was very much like this was a training ground battlefield situation. But as times progressed, they've really switched over to what was this space like back then, and what function did it have, not just as a training ground for Washington's troops, but what role did it have ecologically, and why are our forests just falling down and not regenerating? So they did studies, they fenced off areas to see what happened if deer were excluded from the area, and they found that native seedlings increased like 850% in those areas. It's pretty significant. And they were
I'd
seeing
say
like
so.
species they could like weren't existent in other areas of the park were coming back to the area, like plant species, because there were no deer to mow them down. So they, after a lot of different studies and being able to confirm this, doing an environmental impact statement because it is a national property, they were able to confirm that we have a population of 241 deer per square mile in this park, and we need to bring it down to somewhere
Yeah.
between 31 and 35, which is a massive amount. And it happened. That's what they did is they pulled hunters out. They've tried to do it really strategically to make sure that they minimize both the amount of deer suffering and
Hmm.
the amount of potential human harm. They'll do things like do a lot of cameras out there to see where the deer are going so they know exactly where they're gathering. They'll lure them to certain areas that are outside of populated areas to try and make sure that there's not accidental harm to humans in the process. But they've seen it effectively used in these parks, and they've done it across Gettysburg. They've done it in other areas. There are some evidence that even the number 31 to 35 is a little too high. It's even more effective when you get down to like
Yeah,
28.
I was actually surprised when you gave that number. It still sounded a little high to my unknowledged ears, but
It's weird because like I know at least two deer herds that almost exclusively use 6 acres, which is not a square mile, and there's 13 of them in like that little space. But it is still a lot of deer thinking about historically that 8 to 10 number.
right. Yeah, that's probably why my brain was like,
Yeah.
wow.
Valley Forge is a very cool place. If you're ever in southeastern Pennsylvania, go hang out in Valley Forge because there's meadows, there's all sorts of cool stuff going on, and there's a lot of great habitat restoration. And that had to happen with a deer control method.
Hmm.
Now, on the website for Valley Forge, they said when a contraceptive method that is effective, that's like when that comes online, that's what we're going to pursue. We're not going to try and continue to do this call if we think that we can do it in a more humane way. But also thinking about hunting, hunting is in this case a humane method so long as it's executed obviously in ways that are prioritizing swift death of the animal and safety and all of that sort of thing. That's the humane thing. It's certainly more ethical than a lot of our agricultural practices for livestock is hunting a deer that was out in the wild. And a lot of times people are using that meat to feed people. So it is not just like I'm hanging something on the wall. It is something that it's us being part of the ecosystem again in a way that was our role historically.
Yeah, everybody that I know that hunts deer, uses the meat.
Hmm.
And
Same.
I think as much as sometimes I feel like a hypocrite or maybe sound like one when I say that I couldn't do it, like I just know there would be no part of me that would enjoy the experience
Right.
of
Same.
hunting. But my attitude towards hunting has changed drastically the more that I have learned about the sort of ecological ramifications, as we've just talked about, and also learning more about the attitude with which a lot of people hunt. So, yes, I'm still going to have my own personal feelings, I think, about um some of the ways that people
Yeah.
might hunt, or some of the more of the trophy hunting type thing is a thing that I just don't understand. But I know a lot of people who go out there with the attitude of this feeling of a connection to nature and using the food that they get from it. And it is, I hope, hopefully, we've just sort of outlined and kind of showcased the reasons why this is in the world that we've created a necessary and beneficial thing to do in these areas.
Yeah, it's challenging actually because my part of Pennsylvania is not a place that has a really strong historical hunting tradition within the people who live here now.
Hmm.
So they have a harder time filling the amount of permits because it's still a permitted system around here. They have a hard time getting enough people to hunt to control the deer populations. But I do think it's interesting to think about colonization reset the ecological makeup of Pennsylvania so hardcore, just shook it up and dipped down the deer populations and shot it back up and all of that. And seeing where we are now, trying to sort of look at regaining our role as a top-down control method in an area where we've removed a lot of the other natural factors that would have been top-down. So this is a way of us interacting with nature not unintentionally, like when you have a car, but more intentionally and trying to do things like preserve forests and human lives too. So all of it's connected. We're not we are not separate from each other.
Right.
We are together. So anything before we go to challenges, Sarah?
Nope. Thank you, Casey. As always, enlightening and fun discussion. So thanks for all your info.
Stick around. We're going to give you the challenge for the week. All right, guys, just like deer are influenced by the season, I have a couple different seasonal challenges for deer.
Nice.
So when we hit spring, if you happen upon an adorable little Bambi fawn, leave it alone. Please don't touch it. So the way fawns defend themselves is basically through camouflage and doing nothing. And mom protects them by going and making sure she has a full belly to produce milk and staying away actually most of the day. So if you don't see mom nearby, that's what she's supposed to be doing. She is probably nearby, but she's not being seen. And the longer you hang out there and the more that you mess with that baby, the less likely that it's going to be able to drink its milk and be able to be strong. So if you're very much in like preserve deer life, like I want to be helpful to wildlife, let mama do her thing.
Yep. This is so important. This is such a good challenge because it runs so counterintuitive to what
Right.
so many people want to do. In that sort of protective, caring mode, we think, oh, the poor thing is all alone, and we're just, we would never leave our newborn baby
Right. It's
and
100% not what a
and
human
go,
would do.
and go off. So, yes, that is so important. That is normal. This is what they are supposed to do.
Isn't
Bambi
it
doesn't
kind
help. I'm not.
No, Bambi doesn't have. But I mean, like, I think it's funny that so far we've talked about like really the humane thing for deer is don't help them and kill them actively. But it is true with more context
Oh,
than that.
yes, yes. Lots more context.
During the fall, especially, practice safe driving during the rut. Because again, those deer are not thinking about cars, they're thinking about other stuff. So especially during dawn and dusk, you really need to be able to drive slowly, be aware of your surroundings. It's just good to have in your mind that there could be a deer coming out on the road, and hopefully that helps you drive more slowly. I saw a recommendation, and I will say I'm giving you this of what I've read. I am not giving you, I think you should do more research because I'm not a safety expert. But basically, the instinct you have when you're approaching a deer is to either swerve, which is confusing for the deer, or to slam on the brakes. But when you slam on the brakes, the front of your car goes down and it's more likely to have the deer like impact your
Hmm.
windshield. So they recommend don't swerve. You don't want to slam on your brakes either. You want to try and slow down if you can, but that's kind of the other counterintuitive thing. And then an all seasons sort of deal is if you are like I was 10 years ago and you think hunting is so far from anything that I would find enjoyable and seems to go against any of my values, consider what that means in your area. I took a class once with members of a parks commission, and they had a deer hunting program in the area because they had an overpopulation of deer, and the citizens in the area were so against it that they shut it down. But you still had all the car accidents and the overpopulation and deer coming into people's yards and all of these things that hunting helps mitigate. So think about how you conceptualize that. Think about even if it's something that you could never see yourself, like Sara and I could never see ourselves intentionally killing an animal, there is conservation value to that. And that is a way to connect with nature and with your own heritage in a lot of ways
Yeah.
and provide for your family. So those are my
Ye-
3 challenges.
I love them, and I will add, you could, I know I've talked about this on the podcast before, but I'll recommend it again because it's relevant. If you've never read the book Hatchet, it's a like it's a kid's book, but
Yeah.
it's so good.
Yeah.
And that did help me adjust the way that I thought about hunting in a different context. In that book, it's not about the conservation, but it is about the subsistence and the connection to nature. So that helped me shape my attitude on hunting and also is why I'm afraid of moose. So there you go. Full
So if you
circle.
want to know Sarah's moose fear origin story, we can always do Casey's interaction with the moose scientist and how I
Yeah,
got so excited about moose and how Sarah's terrified of them. So we can do a big deer episode
there you go.
at a later date. But thanks for listening, everybody. I know it's a long one. I know that because it's been a week, it probably wasn't always coherent, but we appreciate you listening to the end. We hope that you'll engage in these challenges. And Sara, if they want to tell us their deer stories, or a shout out from one of the states where deer are their state animal, how can they do so?
Yeah, that would be great. You can find us on Facebook at A Little Greener Podcast. We are still in Instagram jail, so sorry.
We haven't been trying to get out very
No, we
hard,
we
so
have not,
it's just where we're
and
at.
by very hard, we have not been trying at
Not
all,
at all.
but we will eventually get around to trying. But you can also email us at any time, a little greener podcast at gmail.com. And just a reminder, you can also find us on YouTube. You can find episodes there and listen to them with the captions if that is beneficial for you.
If you find these episodes valuable, share with a friend, shout us out somewhere. We really appreciate it. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you in a couple weeks.
Bye.